Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, which means it's time for another history video. As usual, I ran a poll last week where I let the viewers decide the topic of this week's video, and people most wanted me to do a video on the 10 worst medieval rulers, so that's what we're doing today. So for this video, worst means incompetent. It doesn't necessarily mean cruel. There were some highly successful medieval rulers who were also cruel, like Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, whose sadistic human science experiments I talked about last week. He was definitely cruel, but he was also highly successful on the battlefield and accomplished many impressive feats. While we can argue that this type of ruler is bad in the sense of their character, this video will only look at the rulers who are bad in the sense that they were failures. As we'll see though, plenty of rulers were both incompetent and cruel. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, I have Pope John XII. He was a man of very questionable moral character, which, not exactly a characteristic you hope for in the head of the Western Church. His various depravities ultimately led to his failure in the office of the Pope, but outside of the controversy surrounding his personal life, he was also just a pretty big failure. First of all, he went to war with the Lombards in northern Italy, intent on expanding the Papal States, but instead, he lost territory to them. Second, he had no ability at all when it came to keeping the Roman nobility in check and was largely controlled by them. Third, he entered into a conflict with Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the most powerful man in all of Europe at the time. Otto was intent on expending his power into the Papal States, and John decided to try to ally himself with both the Magyars and the Byzantine Empire against him. Instead, Otto captured the ambassadors who were headed to propose these alliances, and there was now open conflict between the emperor and the pope. And this is where his personal life was used as ammunition against him. He lived an incredibly secular life. The Lateran Palace during his reign was often referred to as a brothel. There's some debate as to whether this is literal or figurative, but either way, it tells you the kind of things that were going on inside the papal palace. He had many mistresses, and all of this was just common knowledge. He even gave some land from the church to one of them. In short, he saw himself more as a Roman prince than he did as a pope, as the head of the church. Otto held a church council of his own, which deposed John and appointed a new pope, Leo VIII. John was so disliked by this point that most people, including people within the church, were fine with the idea that he was removed from power. He did still maintain some popularity in Rome itself, and this allowed him to retake Rome, but he didn't have very much power outside of the city as a result of the deposition. Otto and his successors would gain control of the Papal States, and Holy Roman Emperors held considerable power over the papacy as a result of John losing this conflict. At number 9, I have Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia. Wenceslaus's cognomens, that is, names that are appended to the end of his name, tell us a lot about him, as he's often known as Wenceslaus the Drunkard or Wenceslaus the Idle. And if you're familiar with the Christmas carol, Good King Wenceslaus, well, it isn't about this guy. It's about Wenceslaus I, who ruled in the 10th century, but the very existence of Wenceslaus IV is part of the reason why people had to be clear about which Wenceslaus they're referring to in that song. One recurring theme we'll see on this list is that a lot of these failures have very successful parents or predecessors. Wenceslaus's father was Charles IV, who had been both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, the first person to hold both of those titles together. While he did accomplish a lot, one thing he didn't do is have a kid that would go on to be a competent ruler. Wenceslaus, as his nickname implies, drank a whole lot and often didn't want to get involved with any of the nuisances of ruling as King of Bohemia, and when he did, he often made really bad choices or was unnecessarily cruel. Wenceslaus encountered a lot of problems with the nobility and the church, two groups of people you generally can't afford to alienate during your reign. One event really set things in motion for both of these groups to oppose him. In 1393, he insisted on having the power of investiture. In other words, the ability to appoint whoever he wanted to church offices. He wanted to appoint some of his friends so that they could get money out of the position. The Archbishop of Prague, Jan of Janstein, opposed this, and Wenceslaus didn't respond by trying to have a conversation with him. Instead, he abducted the Archbishop's advisor and close friend, John of Nepomuk, and had his cronies torture and eventually murder him. This was not only cruel, but also a really stupid idea. The Archbishop now openly opposed Wenceslaus as the King of Bohemia, and the nobility followed suit, seeing the actions of Wenceslaus as unfit for a king. In the rebellion that ensued, Wenceslaus lost miserably and was arrested and detained. He was eventually freed, but this episode did permanent damage. Wenceslaus was supposed to eventually be elected Holy Roman Emperor, but it never happened as a result of his scandal. In fact, in 1400, he was stripped of his title as King of Germany as a result of his actions in the investiture scandal. In particular, at the hearing discussing whether he should be stripped of this title, he was accused of futility, idleness, negligence, and ignobility. He would manage to maintain his title as King of Bohemia for the rest of his life, but because the nobility and the church made his life difficult at every turn, he held very little real power. At number 8, I have Pope Stephen VI, who is considered by some to be the worst pope ever. His papacy is most remembered for one especially bizarre event. He had his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed from his grave and put him on trial. This event, called the Cadaver Synod, was largely a result of local politics and Stephen's own personal dislike of the man. Formosus had sided with the Duke of Carinthia in a conflict that was ongoing with Lambert of Spoleto, who at the time was the Holy Roman Emperor. Stephen was supported by the Holy Roman Emperor, so his actions were partly a result of this. Ultimately, the result of this posthumous trial were that Formosus was found guilty of heresy, he was stripped of his papal clothing, and thrown in the Tiber River. This might all sound crazy to us today, and people at the time thought it was pretty crazy too. The trial of the dead Formosus spelled the end for Stephen VI, as it was pretty hard for many to entirely wrap their head around what he had done, and even his allies abandoned him in the wake of the Cadaver Synod. A public uprising in Rome led to his capture, and he was strangled in prison not long after that. At number 7, I have the Carolingian Emperor, Charles III, also known as Charles the Fat. The Carolingian dynasty was one founded by Charles Martel, and its most famous ruler was Charlemagne, who by 800 had transformed the land ruled by the Carolingians from just being most of what we call France today into a massive empire that encompassed much of Europe. Charles III was part of this line. He was Charlemagne's great-grandson, but he did not inherit his family's lack for leadership. However, he was really lucky. In 876, he became King of Swabia. That's the territory he was sort of scheduled to inherit, and he did. His brothers, meanwhile, had a lot more territory, but in 880, his brother, the King of Italy, died childless, so he inherited that. In 882, another brother died childless, and he became the ruler of Saxony. Then Louis III of France and his only son Carloman died in 882 and 884 respectively, so then he gained control of France. By 885, he had recreated his great-grandfather's empire with no effort at all. It wasn't a result of his skill as a ruler, it really was just luck. Lots of people he was related to died without kids, and he was the only Carolingian left, so that's just what happened. In reality, his reign over all of these places was marked by ineptitude. Viking invasions were commonplace during his reign, and Charles failed to successfully fight off even one of them. He paid them off on numerous occasions, but this policy really made people angry, especially in 885 when he made a payment to the Vikings who wanted to attack Paris, and then they attacked anyway. Rather than do something about this, he chose to just leave the people in Paris to deal with the siege themselves. Suffice it to say, this made him really unpopular. He was deposed in 887 and died in 888. If he had been a good ruler, he wouldn't have been deposed, and his son would have inherited his titles, and the Carolingian dynasty would have continued. Instead, the Carolingian Empire disintegrated. In short, Charles III was given a really awesome situation with all of his titles and power, but he squandered every bit of it. At number 6, it is Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad. As his nickname suggests, he suffered from serious bouts of mental illness, and these played a role in making him such a bad ruler. His father, Charles V, had turned around the 100 Years' War during his reign, and was nicknamed Charles the Wise as a result of his success. This long-standing conflict between France and England had started in the 1330s, and it was all a result of an English claim to the French crown. The early stages of the war had resulted in many French defeats, but Charles V's military acumen and effective leadership had finally shifted the momentum back in the direction of France. That is, until his son, Charles VI, became king. During his reign, he managed to erase many of his father's successes in the war. One of the big reasons for this was a feud between the French royal family and another powerful French family, the Burgundians. It was not exactly Charles's fault that the conflict began. It had started because of a Burgundian attempt to take his throne during one of his bouts of madness. However, once he came out of the episode, he did not do a good job of managing the situation and had tunnel vision about defeating the Burgundians, which led to chaos throughout France. Multiple attempts at peace were made by various parties, but Charles was insistent on continuing the conflict. And all of this was happening despite the ongoing 100 Years' War. It was at this point that the English king Henry V saw an opportunity. He allied with the Burgundians and then invaded France, crushing Charles's forces at the Battle of Agincourt, one of the most famous medieval battles and the most resounding English victory of the entire war. Charles was forced to sign a treaty that made Henry V his heir, which would mean that the kings of England would now officially become the kings of France after Charles's death. The English had achieved what they sought to with the 100 Years' War, and it appeared they had won. However, an even more inept English king would undo all of this success, and he just happens to be next up on this list. At number 5, I have Henry VI of England. He's kind of an English mirror image of Charles VI. He was a king who really messed up the 100 Years' War despite inheriting a commanding position. He was crowned King of France and England upon the death of his father in 1422. His father, Henry V, who I mentioned earlier, had an impressive military career, and his efforts had put England well in front of France in the war. This is why Henry VI could be crowned as King of France as well, since it was the high watermark of English control in France. However, Henry VI's management of the situation was a polar opposite to his father's, and by the end of his reign in 1453, the 100 Years' War had ended with England as the loser. Now, we can't blame Henry VI for all of this. After all, he was only 1 year old when he became king, and his advisors and regents squandered some of the advantages that Henry V had achieved. But when he did take over, Henry VI's efforts just made matters even worse. He had a tendency to favor certain people in his court simply based on whether he liked them and not based on merit. Most of his favorites manipulated him and were able to get whatever they wanted out of him. His government was rife with corruption, and he quickly became unpopular. Campaigns did continue in France, but morale was extremely low, especially because many soldiers were not being paid. This resulted in various uprisings in the early 1450s and could have been avoided by better fiscal policies on the part of Henry, who was just giving money to his friends. Meanwhile, the French had also mastered the use of artillery, something that the English had used first during the 100 Years' War, but rather than continuing to come up with new artillery pieces during his reign, things largely stagnated under his rule, and by 1453, the French had the upper hand in virtually every way on the battlefield. That year, the last remaining holdings in France were lost, with the exception of Calais. A peace was finally negotiated wherein the kings of England relinquished their claim as kings of France. The outcome was a disaster for English kings, who lost significant power while the French monarchy continued to grow in strength. His failures didn't just make for disaster in terms of English power abroad either. The instability created by Henry VI's inept reign would ultimately result in the War of the Roses, a decades-long civil war in England. At number 4, I have Guy of Lusignan, who was king of Jerusalem between 1186 and 1192. Guy was an outsider and relative newcomer in the Crusader states, but his marriage to Sibylla of Jerusalem resulted in him becoming king of Jerusalem in 1186. When he got the crown, the kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states had been in a long peace with the Ayyubid Sultan Saladin, one that had been negotiated and obtained by Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. Things were very stable and peaceful when he became king, and they had been for almost 10 years. The Crusader states were largely prosperous and hadn't lost any significant territory in about 4 decades. By the end of Guy's reign, though, the kingdom of Jerusalem was entirely lost, and the reasons for that can largely be pinned on Guy himself. One of his first challenges as a king was a noble named Raynald of Chatillon. Raynald was a belligerent, violent man and also a relative newcomer to the Crusader states. He viewed Muslims with disdain, seeing them as nothing but an enemy and as not entirely human. The previous king, Baldwin IV, had managed to keep him under control, but once Guy was on the throne, Raynald began attacking Muslim merchant caravans within his territories and even threatened to build a fleet and attack Mecca itself. All of this was, of course, in violation of the peace agreement. Saladin sent a letter to Guy, telling him to get Raynald under control or it would mean a return to war. For what it's worth, Guy did try to get him under control, but he failed. This led to Saladin invading the Crusader states in 1187. Guy led an army at the Battle of Hattin, but he was thoroughly outmatched by Saladin, playing into his hand at every turn. He and his army were eventually trapped on a geographical formation called the Horns of Hattin, where Saladin crushed Guy's army and destroyed or captured almost the entire Crusader force. The city of Jerusalem was captured later that year, and the kingdom of Jerusalem all but ceased to exist. His ineptitude as a general and as a leader who couldn't control his vassal is ultimately what led to the Crusaders losing the most important city in Christendom. At number 3, I have Constantine VIII, the Byzantine emperor. For the most part in these videos on the Middle Ages, I try to stick mostly to Western Europe. The Byzantine Empire is kind of its own thing during this time, existing in its own sphere of influence in the East, but sometimes something that goes down in the Byzantine Empire is so notable that it makes these lists. For example, Theodora of Byzantium made my list of most influential medieval women. Similarly, Constantine VIII managed to get here, but obviously not because he was awesome, but because he was a terrible ruler. Constantine is yet another ruler who came from impressive lineage. His family was part of a long dynasty of Byzantine emperors called the Macedonian dynasty. However, he never really thought he would be emperor. His older brother, Basil II, was everything you wanted in a Byzantine emperor and is considered by many to be the greatest of them all. He was a skillful diplomat, politician, and general, and he was highly successful at defending and expanding the empire, especially against Bulgarian forces. He was a highly popular and powerful emperor. However, there was one thing he didn't do, and that was that he never had children despite living to the age of 70. This meant that when he died after his long and successful reign, his brother, Constantine, became the new emperor. People weren't happy about this. In fact, for years, when it became clear that Basil wasn't going to have heirs, people advised him to disinherit his brother and choose a new heir because they thought Constantine was so incompetent. Basil was a highly successful man, but he still had flaws. He saw his brother through rose-colored glasses and refused to choose a different heir, believing that his brother would be a good emperor. By the time he had become emperor, Constantine was in his late 60s and had a long life of privilege. Basically, he had a good time being part of the royal family, partied a lot, drank a lot, didn't really have that much interest in running the Byzantine Empire, but now he had to. And he had little interest in his duties, and when he did make use of his imperial power, it was usually to persecute the nobility or grant titles to his friends. He held public executions of people who he perceived had slighted him. He squandered the Byzantine Empire's funds on useless and silly things. He appointed friends to positions in the Byzantine army who had no military experience to speak of, and fired experienced commanders that he didn't like. During his reign, the Byzantine economy collapsed, and the military went from being one of the best in the world under his brother to being an unmitigated disaster by the time of his death. Byzantine historians often point to John's reign as the turning point in Byzantine history, and not in a good way. From here on, the empire would enter into decline, constantly attacked by its neighbors and unable to effectively defend itself. At number 2, I have Aethelread, often erroneously referred to as Aethelread the Unready. Now, that's not to say that his cognomen is much better than that. Unread literally means the badly advised in Old English. This was especially funny to people at the time because in Old English, his name, Aethelread, actually means well-advised. So his name was basically well-advised, the poorly advised. Anyway, Aethelred's main problem as a ruler was his utter failure of the most important issues of his time, and that was relations with Danes. Danes had been settled in part of what we call England today for almost a century at this point in a territory called the Danelaw. They gained this territory as a result of Viking raids and diplomatic negotiations. When Aethelred became king, there had been a pretty long peace between the two groups, but Aethelred's reign would mark the end of all of that. Aethelred lost a major battle to the Danes in 991 and thereafter had to pay a tribute to the Danes to keep them from invading. As tensions continued to rise between the two groups, Aethelred made a grave error. At this point, many Danes or people of Danish descent had actually immigrated into England itself, and in 1002 he was advised by someone who he believed had genuine visions that the Danes in England were going to kill him later that year, so he responded by having as many Danes as possible rounded up and killed. Tensions had already been boiling over between the two groups, but now things had reached a fever pitch. In 1004, the Danish king Sven Forkbeard began a series of successful attacks on England, entirely motivated by the massacre of Danes there, eventually culminating with his conquest of the island in 1013. Sven died in 1014, which Aethelred took advantage of by asserting his royal claim again, and he briefly ruled before dying in 1016. However, the damage done was permanent. By 1016, Sven Forkbeard's son, Canute, had returned and claimed his title. He defeated Aethelred's son and claimed the title of the King of England. In short, Aethelred handled a crisis with the Danes miserably, ultimately spelling the end of his family's rule as kings of England. And at number 1, I have John of England, also known as Bad King John and John Lackland. John was a famously bad king, probably the most well-known one to make the list. If you've seen any of the various versions of Robin Hood, including the Disney version, you've seen a portrayal of this inept king. Like most of the people on this list, John came from some fairly impressive lineage. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, arguably the most powerful woman in the Middle Ages. She was highly capable and at various times actually ruled England herself for her sons. His father was King Henry II, another highly capable ruler who had dramatically expanded the power of the crown during his reign. His immediate predecessor was his brother Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, who wasn't quite as capable of a ruler as his parents had been, but he was a military genius, and heralded as such while he was still alive. John didn't inherit any of those traits, and it's quite difficult to characterize his reign as anything other than a failure, and from the beginning of his life, it didn't look like he would ever be king. His nickname, John Lackland, came about as a result of the fact that he wasn't likely to inherit any land because he had so many older brothers. This was a nickname, by the way, given to him by his own father. But yeah, he had 3 older brothers who were in the line of succession before him. However, those brothers all died without heirs, and John found himself on the throne in 1199. A lot of stuff went wrong for him as king, but we'll focus in on the 2 biggest failures of his 17-year reign. There was a major conflict ongoing with France at the time he reached the throne. In fact, his brother Richard had actually died while at war in France. The conflict largely stemmed from the fact that Eleanor of Aquitaine had married Henry II, and their children, including John, would now inherit a large chunk of France called the Aquitaine. This was in addition to holdings elsewhere in France, like Normandy. Philip III of France spent much of his reign trying to take all the territory held by the English kings, but Richard had largely prevented this. John was not so lucky, and he lost battle after battle, with his family's empire collapsing during his reign. So John managed to drastically weaken English kings by losing a massive swath of land, which made his name John Lackland even funnier. At the same time, his failures helped to strengthen France, which was not good news for England. So there's a foreign policy failure for John. He also had one major domestic policy failure. By 1214, John had lost several separate wars with France. This had been quite expensive, and he had raised taxes to pay for them. He was also a somewhat cruel leader who often imprisoned or executed nobles he saw as a threat, and even disinherited them sometimes. In addition to his failures on the battlefield and elsewhere, people didn't really like the guy because of his fiscal policies, and because his efforts in France failed. When he returned home in 1214, there was a rebellion. John would lose here too, and he was effectively captured and coerced into signing a little document you might have heard of, the Magna Carta, in 1215. This document forced the crown to agree to a number of things which largely empowered the nobility and weakened the king. Nobility now had to have some say, especially in fiscal policy and war and other things. So, in other words, John sort of undid the work that his family had accomplished before him. Henry, Eleanor, and Richard had all managed to maintain the Angevin Empire in the face of French aggression, and they also all had a big hand in strengthening the crown. By the time of John's death in 1216, the crown was the weakest it had been in centuries, and the Angevin Empire had collapsed. Those are my picks for the 10 worst medieval rulers. Are there any you think I left out? Do you think anyone I put on here shouldn't have made the list? Let me know in the comments. If you want to have a say in what I do for next week's video, you can vote in a poll on the community tab now. If you want to stay aware of my future videos, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it as much as you can. The more people who see it, the better. Thanks for watching.